I want to begin with something that Gabor Maté said that permanently changed the way I understand the relationship between the body and the life being lived inside it. He said, the body is not a machine that occasionally breaks down. The body is a witness, the most honest witness available to a human being. It records everything, not selectively, not with the editing and the narrative construction and the self-protective filtering that the conscious mind applies to experience before allowing it into awareness. Everything, every emotion that was felt and suppressed, every need that was present and denied, every truth that was known and not spoken, every version of the self that was real and not permitted to be expressed. The body keeps that record with a fidelity that the mind cannot match and cannot override. And when the record becomes too full, when what has been stored exceeds the body's capacity to hold it silently, the body does the only thing available to it. It speaks, not in language, in symptom, in the specific physical expression of what the psychological and emotional life has been carrying without adequate processing, in the particular location and quality and timing of the pain, the fatigue, the inflammation, the autoimmune response, the digestive disruption, the chronic tension that medicine investigates and treats and sometimes relieves and frequently cannot fully explain. Because medicine, for all its extraordinary sophistication, is often looking at the message without reading it, treating the symptom without asking what the symptom is saying, addressing the body's expression without inquiring into what the body is trying to express. Gabor Maté spent 50 years asking that question in rooms where people had been through every diagnostic test available and been told nothing conclusive was found, in conversations with people whose bodies were producing symptoms of unmistakable significance that the medical charts were recording as unexplained, in clinical encounters where the gap between what the body was saying and what the medical framework was listening for was wide enough to contain an entire autobiography of suppressed emotional experience. He asked, what is this symptom saying? Not what is causing it in the purely mechanical sense. What is it saying? What is it a message about? What has been stored here that needed a form of expression and found this one because no other form was made available? And what he found in patient after patient, across condition after condition, through decades of clinical observation that eventually became some of the most important work in the emerging field of psychoneuroimmunology, was not random, it was not coincidental, it was not the product of individual biological misfortune randomly distributed across the population. It was a pattern, a consistent, specific, documentable pattern in which the body's symptoms were directly connected to the specific emotional and psychological history of the person carrying them, in which the location of the pain was often directly related to the nature of what was being suppressed, in which the timing of the symptoms' onset was frequently traceable to a specific period of significant emotional stress or loss, or the intensification of a long-standing pattern of self-suppression, in which the body's message, when it was finally heard rather than simply treated, made complete and coherent sense as the expression of an inner life that had been running without adequate acknowledgment for too long. Today I want to give you the language for reading that message, the specific framework that Gabor Maté developed for understanding what the nervous system is communicating when it communicates through the body. The 7 things that your physical symptoms may be telling you that no blood test or imaging study or specialist referral has yet found a way to ask about. Not because medicine is wrong. Medicine is often essential and always worth engaging with appropriately. But because medicine and psychological self-inquiry are not competing approaches, they are complementary ones. And the person who brings both, who takes the symptoms seriously at the biological level and asks the honest question at the psychological level, that person has access to a quality of understanding about their own body and their own life that neither approach alone can provide. If something in what I have just said landed somewhere real in you, if your body responded with something, as I described it as a witness and a messenger, I want you to drop 520 in the comments right now. 520. the frequency of the message finally being received rather than simply managed. When you type 520, you're saying, I'm ready to hear what my body has been trying to tell me. Type 520 and let us listen together. Let me begin where Gabor Maté always began, with the connection, with the specific biological mechanism through which emotional experience and physical health are not separate domains, but a single integrated system. The psychoneuroimmunological reality that the nervous system, the endocrine system, and the immune system are in continuous communication with each other and with the emotional and psychological life of the person whose body they constitute. He was precise about this. He was not speaking metaphorically when he said that suppressed emotion affects immune function. He was describing a documented biological reality. The research is extensive and it is consistent. Chronic stress, the specific kind of chronic stress that is produced not by external events alone, but by the internal experience of being chronically disconnected from one's authentic emotional life, chronically suppressing what is genuinely present, chronically performing what is not. That chronic internal stress produces measurable changes in cortisol levels, in inflammatory markers, in immune cell activity, in hormonal regulation, in the specific biological parameters that determine whether the body maintains its health or begins to express its distress in the form of physical symptom. The nervous system is the bridge between the psychological life and the biological one. And the nervous system cannot lie. It cannot pretend at the biological level that everything is fine when everything is not fine. It cannot maintain the performance that the conscious mind is working so hard to sustain. It simply records. And when the recording reaches the threshold, when what has been stored without adequate processing reaches a level that the system can no longer contain silently, the recording finds expression. That expression is what we call symptoms. And those symptoms are not failures, they are communications. They are the body's attempt, the only attempt available to it when other channels have been closed, to bring into awareness what the conscious mind has been keeping out of awareness. They are not punishment, they are not random biological misfortune, they are messages, and they deserve to be read. Now I want to give you the 7 things the nervous system communicates through physical symptoms. 7 specific messages that Gabor Maté identified across decades of clinical observation as the most common and most important things the body says when it finally speaks. Not as a diagnostic framework, as an invitation to honest self-inquiry, to ask, alongside whatever medical care is appropriate, what might this symptom be saying about what I have been carrying without adequate acknowledgement? The first message: you have been suppressing an emotion that needed to be felt. This is the most fundamental message the body sends, and Gabor Maté documented it with extraordinary precision across multiple chronic conditions. The emotion that is not felt does not disappear. It does not simply dissipate into the general background of experience and become irrelevant. It goes somewhere, and where it goes is the body. The specific physiology of this is now well documented. An emotion is not only a psychological experience, it is a biological event, a cascade of hormonal and neurological activity that is a natural arc of activation, expression, and completion. When the expression is interrupted, when the emotion is suppressed before it completes its natural movement to the system, the biological activation does not simply stop, it continues chronically below the level of awareness as a persistent, low-grade physiological state that the body must continually work to manage. That management is expensive. It requires ongoing expenditure of the body's regulatory resources. And over time, over years and decades of managing the suppressed emotional activation, rather than allowing it to complete, the cost accumulates. The regulatory systems become dysregulated, the immune system, pulled between its normal function and its involvement in the chronic stress response, begins to express its overload in the form of physical symptom. Gabor Maté asks, what emotion have you been most consistently not allowing yourself to feel? What feeling arrives and is immediately managed, rerouted, suppressed before it can complete? Where in your body do you feel the most persistent tension or discomfort? And is there a relationship between that location and the emotion that has been most consistently suppressed? The answers to those questions are not always immediately available, but the willingness to ask them with genuine curiosity rather than defensive dismissal is the beginning of reading the message rather than simply managing the symptom. The second message: you have been saying yes when your whole being was saying no. Gabor Maté encountered this with particular frequency in patients with autoimmune conditions, conditions in which the immune system attacks the body's own tissue. He noticed a pattern so consistent, it became one of the central observations of his clinical career. The people whose immune systems were attacking themselves were, with remarkable consistency, people who had spent years attacking themselves in a different sense, saying yes to demands that their deeper self was saying no to, making themselves available to obligations, relationships, and circumstances that violated something essential in them, while maintaining the surface performance of willingness and compliance. The autoimmune metaphor is precise. The body turned against itself is the biological expression of a self that has been turned against itself for long enough that the immune system is simply implementing at the cellular level what has been happening at the psychological level for years. But the message is not limited to autoimmune conditions. Any chronic condition that involves the body working against its own functioning, inflammation, chronic pain, digestive conditions that involve the system attacking its own mucosa, any of these can carry the same message. Where in your life have you been saying yes with your words and no with your body? Where have you been making yourself available in ways that your authentic self has been quietly, consistently refusing? And how long has that refusal been looking for a form of expression? The body found one. The question is whether you're willing to hear what it is saying before the expression intensifies. The third message: you've been carrying something that was never yours to carry. Gabor Maté observed this in people whose physical symptoms had no clear origin in their own experience, but whose family histories contained significant unprocessed pain. The specific mechanism, now studied in the field of epigenetics, the science of how experience influences gene expression across generations, through which unprocessed trauma in one generation can influence the biological and psychological functioning of subsequent generations, is real and documented. But Gabor Maté also observed it at the simpler psychological level. The person who became the emotional container for a family system that had no other adequate container, who absorbed and held the anxiety, the grief, the unspoken truth of the family without being asked to and without being acknowledged for doing so, who has been carrying a weight that was assembled from materials that were never theirs, and that the body is now expressing as the specific, chronic, persistent symptom of someone who has been bearing too much for too long. The question you would ask is not simply what happened to you, but what were you asked to hold that was not yours to hold? What did you absorb from the people around you in childhood, in your family system, in your most significant relationships that you took on as your own without recognizing that you were taking it on? And what would it mean to put it down? The body that has been carrying what was never its weight knows the answer to that question before the mind does. It has been asking to put it down for a very long time. The fourth message: your boundaries have been violated for so long that the body is now enforcing them. When the psychological self cannot or will not establish the limits that protect its own integrity, when the practiced compliance, the habitual people-pleasing, the chronic self-erasure prevents the person from saying no in any relational context, the body sometimes says it instead. Gabor Maté observed this in people whose physical symptoms functioned at a practical level as the boundary their psychology could not enforce. The person who could not say no to demands became someone whose body literally could not fulfill them. The person who could not create space for their own needs in their relational life developed symptoms that required others to make space for them. The person whose authentic self had been so consistently overridden that no conscious mechanism for protecting it remained, found that the body was protecting it to the only means still available. This is not manipulation. It is not unconscious strategizing. It is the body's last resort, the final enforcement mechanism of a self that has no other way to protect what needs protecting. And the message it carries is precise. You have been giving access to parts of yourself that needed protection. You have been overriding your own limits in service of other people's comfort or approval or need. And the body has taken over the function of the limit because you were not available to perform it. The work is not to overcome the symptom. It is to understand what the symptom is protecting and to develop genuinely, gradually, at real personal cost, the capacity to protect it consciously, so that the body does not have to. The fifth message. You have been living at a distance from your authentic self for too long. Gabor Maté was precise about this. He called it the loss of self. And he documented its biological consequences with extraordinary specificity. The person who is chronically disconnected from their authentic emotional experience, who has built such an effective system of management and performance and the presentation of a socially acceptable self, that the genuine self beneath the performance has become largely inaccessible. That person's body is under a particular kind of chronic stress that has nothing to do with external events. The stress of inauthenticity, of the persistent gap between what is being experienced internally and what is being expressed externally, of the ongoing metabolic expense of maintaining the performance, of the specific physiological cost of a nervous system that is perpetually running two parallel tracks, the genuine one and the presented one, and expending significant resources, keeping them from colliding. The body cannot sustain that expense indefinitely. And when it reaches the limit of what it can sustain, the expression of that limit often takes the form of a physical symptom, of exhaustion so complete that the performance becomes impossible to maintain, of pain that insists on attention that the performance had been preventing, of the specific physical communication of a self that has been running on the wrong fuel for too long and is finally, irrevocably running out. The message is not complicated. The life you have been living is not fully yours. And the body knows the cost of that in a way the mind has been too busy managing to register. The sixth message. There's a grief you have never allowed yourself to complete. Gabor Maté understood grief as a biological process as much as a psychological one. The specific sequence of neurological and hormonal activity that constitutes the natural grief response has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when that sequence is interrupted, when the grief is managed or suppressed or converted into productivity or wrapped in a spiritual framework that bypasses the actual felt experience of loss, the interruption does not end the biological process. It only prevents its completion. An incomplete grief, interrupted grief, managed grief, grief that was never fully allowed to move through the system, stays in the body as a persistent activation, as the baseline physiological state that the body must continuously regulate, as the specific chronic condition of a nervous system that is simultaneously trying to complete a process that has not been allowed to complete. He sat with people whose physical symptoms traced directly, when the emotional history was honestly examined, to specific losses that had never been fully grieved. Losses that were too large or too early or too surrounded by the needs of others to be given the full space they required. Losses that were sealed over with the performance of coping rather than allowed the full depth of mourning that their genuine significance warranted. The body was still grieving what the mind had decided it was time to move on from. And the symptom was the grief, still in process, still looking for completion, still asking for the space that was never given. The seventh message. And this is the one that Gabor Maté returned to as the most fundamental, the most important, the one that underlies all the others, and that, when it is genuinely heard, makes all the others more navigable. Your body is telling you that the life you are living needs to change in a way that you have not yet been willing to let it change. Not a small adjustment, not a better morning routine or a different exercise regimen or the addition of a mindfulness practice to a life that is otherwise organized or on the same fundamental patterns that produce the symptom. Something more fundamental than any of those things. A genuine reorientation. A change in the direction of greater authenticity, greater self-honoring, greater alignment between the life being lived and the life that the authentic self actually requires. Gabor Maté was honest about how difficult this message is to receive, because receiving it fully means acknowledging that the symptom is not simply an unfortunate biological event that needs to be resolved so that the current life can continue unchanged. It means acknowledging that the current life itself, in some specific, important, perhaps uncomfortable way, is part of what the symptom is responding to. And that genuine healing requires not just treatment of the symptom, but honest inquiry into the life that is producing it. That inquiry is not comfortable. It requires the willingness to look at what has been suppressed and why, at what the body has been carrying without acknowledgement, at where yes has been said when the whole being was saying no, at what grief has not been completed, at what authenticity has been sacrificed, at what genuine change would look like and what it would cost, and whether the cost of the change is finally being weighed honestly against the cost of the symptom. The body has been weighing those costs for a long time. It has been sending the message through the symptom, through the persistence of the symptom despite treatment, through the return of the symptom after temporary relief, through the migration of the symptom to new locations when the old ones are addressed without the underlying message being heard. The nervous system cannot lie. It has been telling the truth about what is needed, in the only language available to it when the other channels have been closed. The question is whether you are finally ready to hear it. Not as a burden, as an extraordinary act of care. The body's willingness to persist in communicating what the conscious mind has been too defended or too busy or too afraid to acknowledge is not an attack, it is loyalty. It is the most faithful possible expression of a system that is completely committed to the well-being of the whole person, not just the presented person, not just the performing person, not just the person the world has been allowed to see, but the whole person, the authentic one, the one whose genuine needs and genuine feelings and genuine limits and genuine grief the symptom has been patiently, persistently, at considerable cost to itself, trying to bring into the light. That person deserves to be heard by you first, above all others. And the privilege of a lifetime, the one that Gabor Maté devoted everything to pointing toward, in every room, in every book, in every hour of sitting with human beings, at the full, honest depth of their most unguarded experience. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not the person who managed the symptom, not the person who maintained the performance until the body could no longer sustain it, but who you truly are, in full, with your authentic emotions and your genuine needs and your real grief and your honest limits and the specific life that the whole of you, body and soul and nervous system and everything the nervous system cannot lie about, was always actually trying to live. Your body has been asking for that life. It is time to listen.